And in this greatest of all possible countries, despite a recent Supreme Court decision which finally overturned a sodomy law in Texas that made it a crime for two people of the same sex to have sexual relations with each other, despite this Supreme Court decision, it remains a fact that those whose sexual orientation does not conform to the dominant male-female relations, or who in one way or another do not fit the stereotypes of what a man and a woman is supposed to be in this society, they are cruelly persecuted and discriminated against and often subjected to vicious and brutal attacks. Not long after that Supreme Court decision, Bush started openly pushing to codify, as he said, to make it a matter of law that marriage must be defined as taking place only between a man and a woman. The Bible tells us that this is what marriage is, according to people like Bush. Besides everything else, it appears that Bush doesn't even know his Bible, even though he's always talking about it. According to the Bible, according to the so-called law of Moses, a man can have more than one wife. If anyone doesn't believe the Bible says that, tell them to read the first 5 books, the so-called Mosaic books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So is Bush going to push to codify that as well? Does he want to make it a law that a man can have many wives? What is he, a fucking Mormon? Or is he just trying to promote old, reactionary, oppressive, traditional values? In other words, traditions change when it comes to family and intimate relations among people. Now, some of this sounds funny, but again, it's deadly serious. Many people know what happened to Matthew Shepard, a young gay student in Wyoming. He was taken by some good old boys because he annoyed them at being gay. They brutally beat him to death, and that wasn't all. They hung him up on a barbed wire fence, calling to mind the lynchings that I've spoken of. This is what happens in this greatest of all countries. This is a result of the kinds of relations and values that are represented by so-called leaders of the land like Bush with their whole cowboy thing. A little lesser known story is the story of Sakia Gunn, a 15-year-old African-American lesbian from Newark, New Jersey, who was beaten to death one night in that state. It wasn't bad enough that she was beaten to death, but then the school officials and other authorities in the city completely ignored this. Usually when a youth is killed in the city, they have some kind of ceremonies, some kind of memorials. They had none of that for her until this became such an outrage that they had to back up. And among this was not only the outpouring of people in general, but the outpouring of teenage black lesbians who before that had been forced into the shadows. And then there is the terrible, devastating disease AIDS, and the cynical way in which the government and powerful financial interests have dealt with this. While at times making a few sounds about how AIDS is a terrible thing and the resources of government should be used to fight this disease, the United States government has never followed through on this in any serious and consistent way. And the drug companies and others in the health industry, as they call it, have never undertaken the research or provided the treatment that is called for. Whatever they have done has been guided for their concern for the bottom line and whether they can make a healthy profit, regardless of the health of people. And AIDS is an even more devastating disease in other parts of the world, especially in the countries of the third world. This is a result of the domination, robbery, and ruin of these countries by the U.S. and other rich and powerful countries, and the poverty and poor health conditions that have been the consequence of this. For example, a very real epidemic of AIDS is running through southern Africa and threatens to wipe out huge sections of youth there. But the terrible suffering and death of millions of youth in Africa is of little concern to the drug companies and the governments that back them. It is of far less concern than maintaining profitable conditions for producing and selling drugs that that can at least treat AIDS. So these drugs are sold at prices that are beyond the reach of millions who suffer from AIDS. And the drug companies and powerful governments fight against attempts to get these drugs to people at a price they might be able to afford. Now, recently, in the face of outcry and outpouring and uprising against this, the U.S. government has made a few noises about, oh yes, okay, we'll allow them to buy some generic drugs. We won't insist on the same standards to protect the drug companies so these drugs can get to the people in terrible need. But as pointed out by Doctors Without Borders and others who are actively involved in the fight against AIDS, the conditions that the U.S. is attaching somewhat more quietly to these so-called concessions is going to mean that nothing will really change, and the situation will continue where the governments back the drug companies in pricing the drugs that are so desperately needed by people beyond what they can afford.